then you could use basically anything. I could write a book and it could be used for free.
But you're not as persuasive as Jesus is.
But
because he's got an authority in our culture that you don't have.
Well, I
which
could
is
say it was Jesus.
And people do.
Yeah.
Right. Any political position you can find, you can go to the bookstore and find a book where somebody says that that's the Christian position. I'm actually going to be teaching a class on that next semester about how people interpret Jesus to support like every political position you can imagine. When it seems to me that he was an apocalyptic prophet, it probably wouldn't have supported any of our political positions. You guys usually have something to say and you're being really quiet right now. Okay, just be quiet. Yeah, all right, nothing? Okay.
Kind of like that sheet that you handed out that we read the other day, and he teaches you the morals, values, and like he gave that little paragraph on like why to study it. Those could be good things that come out of it.
Well, Prothero and Ingersoll both oppose the idea of religion being about moral education. Oh, you're talking about Ehrman.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ehrman thinks that there's timeless value to the Bible, that it's got morals to teach us. Even if, for Ehrman, he obviously doesn't buy the whole Bible, but he thinks that there's nonetheless timeless values to be used in it. So Ehrman disagrees with Avalos on this point, it seems fundamentally. Avalos thinks that there aren't timeless values in the Bible. Now, tied up with that,
it's also like saying there's like timeless value in like children's books too. Like there's kind of an authority to the book, like everybody poops, you know, but like that doesn't mean that it's like.
There's a book called Everybody Poops?
Yeah, it's like for little kids. Poop.
No way.
But
I wish I'd read that.
yeah.
I gotta go look at it.
But like, you know, you could say that there's value to that because it's teaching you lessons as well. But it's not, you know, it doesn't mean that it's like an authoritative piece of literature.
Those things are not really timeless though, because the stories that they taught children 300 years ago we're not using anymore today. Because they included things like, you know, it's okay to enslave darkies because they're different than us, right? No, that's what I wish I had saved this, but I found a book online. It was scanned and put online. It was a book from about 100 years ago that portrayed Indians as feeding their children to the crocodiles of the Ganges River. And it was basically like, you know, these are bad people because their mothers throw their children to the crocodiles. We don't use that. That's not a timeless value that we're still using today. But yeah, I mean, your point seems to be that you can make a moral to the story in almost any kind of literature, but the Bible has a particular authority that a lot of that other stuff doesn't have, which is why people like still continue to appeal to Jesus. Even non-Christians appeal to Jesus. There are Buddhist books. There's a guy named Thich Nhat Hanh who's a Zen Buddhist. No, not Zen. Vietnamese Buddhist. And he wrote a book about Jesus, about how Jesus supports his view. Because Jesus has that kind of authority that everybody wants to claim him and his position as their own. Now, I want to move on to the other thing, the end of biblical studies, but before we do, I wanted to mention, to go back to the timeless value thing, since you brought it up, I was thinking about one of the things that you said, Ginny, when we were discussing the timeless value thing, how we could make Jesus' teaching on, I asked you two questions, you answered both of them. What were they? One of them had to do with Jesus' teaching on being a eunuch. What was the other one? Anyhow, let's take the eunuch one, right? And you gave an answer. Like, if we modified the meaning, we could make it mean this for us today. Now, I was thinking about that later on, and my thought later on was, you've modified it so much that it's really more you than it is Jesus. So it's not really a timeless value so much as your value that you're projecting back onto Jesus. Now, I don't know if I could prove that's the case. I don't know if I would follow that argument 100% all the way down, but I think there's something to it that it doesn't necessarily have a timeless value if we reinvent it to suit us. Then it's really our values.
I think everybody takes something different from everything you read.
Yeah, in part that's inevitable because of the way that human beings work. When we read stuff, we project ourselves onto it. So let's move on to the end of biblical studies. This reading that you read on Prothero, this was part of this journal issue where we focused on Prothero's book. This other thing by Avalos is his big kind of manifesto for biblical studies. Says this early in the book, and this is the main thesis of his book. The only mission of biblical studies should be to end biblical studies as we know it. His number one target is people, scholars of the Bible, who basically utilize a devotional, and I should point out, hardly any biblical studies scholar is 100% devotional, but a lot of them are 5% devotional, 10% devotional. And for for Avalos, it should not be devotional at all. For him, the agenda of biblical studies should not be, what does this mean for us today, but should be the historical critical method. In addition, points out that in the past it's been devotional and apologetic, meaning that it's defended the Bible against criticisms of the Bible, right? There was a guy famously who came out. You guys remember reading the letter to the Galatians? It was a little bit confusing, right? There's a scholar who said one of the reasons why we have difficulty interpreting Paul's message in Galatians and Romans is that perhaps he contradicts himself. And the general response was, of course Paul doesn't contradict himself. It's a divine text. He can't contradict himself because it's perfect. Now, nobody would put it exactly like that, but people resisted the idea that he might contradict himself. Now, I imagine the general response of this guy would be like, Anthony, are you a human being? When you write, do you sometimes contradict yourself? If you wrote a big book, Jim, do you think you might make some errors or mistakes or contradict yourself a little bit? Right? I wrote a book, it's coming out this fall. I imagine people write me letters saying, dude, you're an idiot and this is why, because you contradicted yourself here on page 2, and I can probably be like, yeah, that's probably right. So this guy writes a book, and he's like, part of the reason why we're confused about what Paul says is because Paul is confusing and he contradicts himself. And the general response was, no, he doesn't. We can't say he would contradict himself. That is apologetic, defending Paul against people who might assume that he makes contradictions. So, the end of biblical studies. Biblical studies has been devotional and apologetic, and in addition, it goes without saying, that biblical studies as a group maintains the authority of the Bible.